Hello, drawing students. This is a lecture on line sensitivity. And so this is the next subject that we will be talking about. And it is the next step after really citing straight line construction, learning how to build correct proportions in the drawing. So that's really what we've been focusing on so far this semester, is learning how to draw things correctly in space. So we first studied like gestures and citing, and we've been really kind of honing on citing for a while, and you will always be using that for the rest of the semester. And then we focused on some perspective, so you could kind of learn how things exist in space. It's really important, and hopefully you'll be able to really delve into perspective more in future classes. You really just got a little bit of a taste of it in this class. So we're going to build off of what we know of drawing things correctly and drawing them in space and drawing correct proportions, and then we're going to make them look as realistic as possible just using line. And so we're going to focus on really what is it's more of a formal aspect of drawing, called line sensitivity. It's also known as line variation, and you may have heard me use the term before. So what is line sensitivity? Well, think of the word sensitive, which means having the power of sensation, or that's kind of weird, but ready and delicate in response to outside influences, able to register minute changes or differences. It's very important. So this is not just a line for a line's sake. It's not just, it's thinking very deeply about line. That line is not just what you may think it is. It's not just at face value, like a line is a line from point A to point B. No, it is your drawing of line is very purposeful, and it's sensitive to outside influences, being the information that the object is giving you. You are sensitive to that information and your interpretation of that information. You are interpreting it and translating it through line sensitivity. So sensitive line is sensitive in its description of and response to both inner and outer contours or edges of an object. It registers minute changes or differences found along contours or edges. Sensitive line conveys a strong sense of volume, mass, form, weight, dimensionality, and space. Goodness gracious. Sorry. I've done this lecture several times, and I always forget to take this out of there. Oh well. It is what it is. Okay, so don't just breeze by that definition too quickly. It's very important. So talking about the definition of sensitive, it's able to register minute changes or differences. So we're thinking very detailed with this line. Again, it's drawing objects as realistically as possible just using line. So we're thinking about both inner and outer contours or edges of the object. So we're looking at the exterior edges of the object here, right around the exterior of the object, but we're also thinking about interior information. So no longer is just the exterior lines, so just the outer lines of an object. That is no longer enough. That will not at all cut it with these drawings. You have got to give more internal information in the object to describe what the object is and the texture of that object. That's really important. Texture is probably the most important part of this of this formal aspect of drawing. It registers minute changes or differences found along contours or edges. So we're not just drawing this as an oval shape, because it's an overall like an oval shape, wide over here and thinner over here. We're looking at all of the minute changes and the changes in direction that this line takes. So it's rather bumpy, and we're not just generalizing that. We're looking very specifically at exactly what that line is doing, exactly what the outside edge of the object is doing, and exactly what the interior edges of the object is doing. And it's important that your sensitive line conveys a strong sense of volume, mass, form, weight, and dimensionality and space. That's a lot to require of a line. That's a lot to require of line at all. And that's why you are very specific and very detailed with the line that you are drawing, the information that you are taking in from the object, the information that you are objectively observing. Remember that from the very beginning of this semester, the very beginning of the very first day. It's about objectively observing the object or objects or whatever it is that you're drawing in life and registering the minute changes that are inside of it. And that's how you get realistic drawings. So, 3 main qualities of line. So we're talking a lot about drawing lines sensitively. So being just very intentional with the line that you're drawing. So how are we intentional with it? What are the different qualities of it? So we have weight, which is the thickness or thinness of the line. We have value, which is the darkness or lightness of the line. And we have texture, which is the roughness or smoothness of the line. So again, we have thick and thin line, and here's some examples of that. We have thick lines here, thin lines here, light and dark lines, so the value of the line, and then the texture of the line. The line doesn't have to necessarily be very hard, it can be soft. So we are paying attention to what the object is doing, what the surface of the object is doing, and determining what kind of line will help interpret what this object is and what the texture of this object is. And texture is the most important part of this assignment, can you draw the texture correctly of the object just using line. And your line does not stay one characteristic from beginning to end. It takes on many different characteristics. It can change from thick to thin, and it should. It can change from dark to light, and it should. And it can change from soft to hard, and it should. So it does not just have one of these qualities when you're drawing a line. It has many. So again, weight, the thickness and thinness of the line, value, the darkness and lightness of the line, and the texture, the roughness or smoothness of the line. So all of these characteristics should exist in your drawings, and each line should have multiple qualities to best interpret what the texture of the object is doing. Okay, so we have the characteristics of line, which are those three main qualities of line, really, characteristics, qualities. So we have those 3 main things. So then how do we apply them to the drawing? Okay, so again, we are taking in the information of the object and we are interpreting it, but there are specific applications to think of when using line sensitivity, because it is a lot different than just drawing with value. You're asking a lot of the line to be as descriptive as possible. So one thing we need to start thinking about is light source. You should have a strong light source on your objects. That is a light or a lamp on an angle on the objects, not just any arbitrary, just room light. We need a specific light on the objects, and that will become very important for value. So it's a good thing to start to start practicing with that. So if we think about light source, there is a light that's over here somewhere on the objects. And the reason why we know that is because the line on the top of the objects like this gets very light and almost becomes what's called an implied line. Implied means that eventually the line fades away and it comes back, but it fades away at a point where that like a specific area for a specific reason that the artist has chosen. So the artist has chosen, okay, this line is going to fade away because the light source is really strong right here. So it's probably a really sharp highlight right there. So that's what they're doing. Again, over here and at the top of this box here. And look, we're still using all of our sighting techniques. Look at the straight line construction and the sighting that's happening between objects here. There's this diagonal line here, diagonal line here. We still have axis lines, and we're still using that straight line construction. Weight and tension refers to where the weight of the object is sitting. So for instance, these two objects are sitting on their surfaces. This is the bottom of the objects. This is also where what we call the occlusion shadow is, and we'll go back to that when we do value. But that is the darkest area of the object, is right directly underneath of it where it's sitting on a surface. So that should have a relatively thicker line than the rest of the line. Let's just show where the weight of the object is sitting. There's also spatial sequence. So that's talking about how objects are in the foreground, middle ground, and background. Objects that are near the foreground or line texture that is in the foreground should be darker, have more contrast than the line farther away. And that's because more contrast pulls forward much farther than line without much contrast. Line without much contrast, or a lighter line, goes farther, appears farther away. So that is how you're able to interpret spatial sequence, especially when you have a really complicated scene. So for something like this, we have a complicated scene like this, and what I'll give you the choice of doing is either more complex drawing of how many objects are, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 objects, or a couple drawings of 3 to 4 objects. But notice how we have a lot of contrast up here in this line here, but the contrast gets less and less the farther away we get. However, we're still using sensitive line. We're still being very specific with the line. Notice how we have line that kind of fades away. It's very delicate in here, and that's to show the delicateness of these leaves. And the texture of the line changes based on the texture of the object. So we have very exact kind of sharp line here that's got a nice exact edge. However, when we do the leaves in like an organic thing, something like foliage, it has a much rougher line because it's a natural object. These are man-made objects. They have harder edges, so these have a harder line. And so they've used a lot of line sensitivity in the detail on the surface of this object to show things moving forward. And they're using actually a lot of different applications of line in here as well. But texture of the line is really important here as well. So notice the different texture of the line in the hat as opposed to on the lamp that it's on, right? Again, a man-made hard surfaced thing has a hard edge, but the hat, which is again man-made, but it's a soft texture, so it has a rougher edge. All right. Strength of an edge. Strength or force of an edge is what this is called. And that's talking about the outer contours of objects rather as opposed to the inner contours of objects. So, and just look at the crazy line sensitivity that's going on in here. This is supremely detailed. This is a creature that they have made. This was an assignment that we did last year, and that is where you take objects from around your home and you make it into a creature. And this is a turtle, and so we have the fin of the turtle over here, and the coffee filters are making up the head and stuff like that. Okay, but thinking about the application of the line, strength of an edge, we have decided to make the outer edges of the objects slightly darker, and that is to differentiate them from the detailed line that's going on all over the drawing. They have a lot of detail about the changes of the fabric. These are probably all value shapes, and they've outlined them all. So we have a detailed line in here on the tape and all the, different changes and folds in the coffee filter. Those are drawn very delicately because those are delicate folds that are happening, but they're still including them because that adds so much more detail and information, and it makes for a much more realistic drawing. And they've decided to use darker line around the outer edges of things to differentiate those lines because there are a lot of lines going on. All right. And then lastly, we have overlapping. So this is a really good and simple use of line sensitivity. And that is where, and I would argue that could be quite a bit pushed in this drawing. That is when you have a line that overlaps a line of an object behind it. So the line that is on the object that is in front should be darker than the object that is behind it. And that's so that that object comes forward. Because again, with just using line, it is a lot harder to differentiate between objects. So when lines overlap other lines, we need to have a differentiation of what's in front of what, so it doesn't get too confusing. And I would say that we could bump up the contrast and the dark. We can make the line on the gun a lot darker so it comes out farther from the corn that's behind it. But we are doing that down here with the butt of the gun here and the trigger. So things are kind of overlapping here. Oh, I said lastly, but that wasn't lastly. So again, we could make the line on this gourd a little bit darker here to kind of come in front of that shoe. I think, okay, this one is the last one. So then focal point is the last use or application of the line. And that is when you decide on one area where you're going to add a lot of contrast, because that's the focal point that you want to be the focal of. You want to be the center of the drawing. Not the center, but you want to be the focal point of the drawing, so that has the most information, the most contrast. So we may be able to do a focal point study, I'm not sure, but so that is the last application of line. The artist has decided this is where my focal point is going to be. Now, I want you guys to use line sensitivity throughout the entire drawing. So, but you can decide to have one area that has the most detail in it, but really everything should have detail in it. So we're really striving for more of something like, that'd be great if we could get as detailed as this, but something like this where we have several objects in the composition. And I'm going to do a demo for you. I'm only going to do a demo of 3 objects, but you do again have the choice of doing 7 or 8 objects in one drawing, or 2 drawings of 3 to 4 objects. But I will say that we do want this level of detail, so we want to draw the entire drawing. Okay, we don't want to we do not want to just draw objects and then nothing, right? On the page, we want to consider spatial sequence. We want to consider foreground, middle ground, and background. So you should have some indication of the surface of the objects, the surface that the objects are sitting on. So for instance, we have objects here, and then we have this fabric here that gives an indication of the space that these objects are in, because the fabric is coming up front here, but it also wraps around and goes back. So we don't just want objects and then nothing. We want to start thinking about the space, and that's partly why we were drawing in perspective as well, so we can start to use that knowledge of knowing how things exist in space. All right. And that is all that I have for you. And then make sure you watch the demo that corresponds to this lecture.